Hey everyone, in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Yvonne Bernard back on the show, and today we're doing one of our monthly threat report episodes. So we've got a lot of interesting data to comb through, some changes from what we've seen threat actors doing in previous months, plus we're going to dive into some of the really big news stories over the last month as well. The big one being the breach of Microsoft executive emails by the threat actor known as Midnight Blizzard. We're also going to talk about another ransomware attack. We're going to talk about the breach of AnyDesk and lots more in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got Yvonne Bernard. How's it going, Yvonne?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, Yvonne, I know we've had you on the show a couple of times here. In fact, you are guest number one if I go all the way back to episode number one. So that's a trophy nobody can take away from you, right? So you have bragging rights because of that. But in the event that we've got some new viewers, maybe they don't know who you are, can you give us a quick introduction to yourself?
Sure. My name is Yvonne Bernard, CTO at Hornetsecurity. I'm with the company since nearly 10 years. So I have my fair share of insights of Hornetsecurity. Before that, I was a researcher at the University of Hannover, doing my Ph.D. in computer science, a little bit of AI stuff there. That's where I'm coming from. And here I'm responsible for product development, security lab, innovation and research. So everything that is technical but doesn't need a power plug.
Sounds good. And I always love having you on the show because of that researcher background. You have a lot of insights that, that I don't think of myself a lot of times just because of that researcher background, right? So it's great having you on the show as always. And we've got some interesting stuff to talk about today. And for those who maybe are new to this type of episode, once a month we do a monthly threat review episode, a monthly threat report episode. Every month here at Hornetsecurity, we release a report that essentially talks about some of our data, our own data and our own findings for the month in terms of email security. What does the threat landscape look like? So we go through that data as part of this episode, and then we also provide some commentary on some of the happenings in the industry. Like, for example, today we're going to be talking about the recent attack of Microsoft executive emails by Midnight Blizzard. So that's a whole thing that we're going to get into a little bit. We're going to talk about how AnyDesk was recently breached, and we're going to talk about supply chain attacks in general. We're going to talk about ransomware because, surprise, there was another ransomware attack, to probably no one's surprise. And then from there, we've got some conversation around Copilot. So what do you think, Yvonne? Should we dive right in here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Sounds good. So I always start with our data in these monthly threat report episodes. And just a quick highlight, if you want all the nitty-gritty details, I'll have the link to the written report in the show notes. So be sure to check that out if you want the nitty-gritty details. But at a high level here, what we saw in our data for the month of January, so our data period here is basically the month of January. What we saw is that the number of low-effort, high-volume email attacks that you usually see around the holiday periods has continued to decrease. So we saw a decrease in last month's report, and that trend has continued. That said, we have seen a slight increase in more targeted, more complex email attacks that utilize, more spear phishing type of behaviors and maybe use malicious attachments. So, to kind of support that claim that we're seeing more complex, more targeted attacks, we have seen a near universal increase in the amount of malicious file attachments. The top three are HTML, PDF, and archive. Those have been like the top three for about 6 months now, if I remember correctly. But what do you think, Yvonne? I mean, it's pretty... I guess the good news here is that it's following the usual trend. So as we come up to the holiday period, Thanksgiving, Christmas here in the U.S., and the rest of the world, you see kind of a flood of these really low effort high volume style of attacks where people are trying to capitalize on, people online shopping, a lot of shipping going around, that type of thing. I guess that's the good news, right? But maybe the not so good news is now we're getting back to, I guess I would say, threat actors regularly scheduled programming, and that attacks are becoming more targeted. What are your thoughts?
Yep. Yeah, I think you can clearly see that the degree of automation helps them to even work during holiday season with throwing out mass emails, which are kind of expected, like shipping industry and so on. And now they're back to actual work, meaning spear phishing attacks and really things where they have to make some manual effort in order to really be successful. So, yeah. Basically, evil never sleeps, but threat actors are back at regular work again.
That's for sure, and it's kind of interesting. I always try to think about this from the threat actor's perspective. It makes sense why during the holidays we see an uptick in the volume. It's like they're casting a wider net, but at the same time, I have to wonder if in their own thought process, they're wondering like, okay, it's the holidays. Maybe I'm going to take a little bit of a vacation, and this is going to go into automation mode, right?
And also the increased volume just shows they're trying to keep their monthly money at even by just sending out more. They have less likely to succeed because those are not the targeted attacks. But if you increase the volume, you have a steady income as well.
Yep. It's always interesting to see those data trends. In other data that we have from our data period here, we saw that the most targeted industries were mining, media, and manufacturing, with a notable fourth place being the research industry. The reason we noted that is because it was so close between third and fourth place. And I think the really interesting one here that has gotten into the top 4 that I've mentioned here is media. Media historically has not been super high on the list, and I just think about the state of the world today. There's a lot going on. We've got elections coming up here in the U.S., for example, and there's wars happening. There's fighting in the Middle East. I have to believe part of that is threat actors trying to inject themselves into that conversation in some way, shape, or form. But I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on that or any of the other industries that are at the top of the list this month, Yvonne.
Yeah, I think media can really be connected to elections coming up in the US. And I think last time with elections, it was similar. People were trying to be present in media and probably also changing, search engine results into their favor and really manipulating elections in the end. And I think that's something we can expect in the next months to also see in the trends coming up. With mining, I'm not so sure. And research is always, I would say, on the top 3 to 5. So that's not so unexpected.
Yeah, our colleague Umut Alamdar, we've had him on the show before, and he and I have kind of dug into the research space a little bit, and we always figure specifically because there's intellectual property involved there, right? Yeah. So I mean, not only can a threat actor get in and try to ransom that environment, but they can also hold the intellectual property ransom itself, right? And a double extortion type of attack. So that one always makes sense. The mining industry is interesting. And I mean, it is consistently in our top 3 and has been for as long as I've been involved in the monthly threat report. And I always look at it just because there's so much money in that particular industry whenever you're dealing with precious metals. And that's always an interesting one. One of my other podcast guests, Eric Syren, he and I were talking about this, and one of these days I'm going to do an episode specifically about that data point, like why mining, right? It'll be an interesting one to do. Anyway, so Our last hard data point that I want to talk about here, we always look at most impersonated brands as part of the monthly threat report. And we had an interesting change in the data this month. For a long time going back, at least 6 months now, DHL was at the top of our list as most impersonated brands. Well, we've had a change, but it's not as much of a change as people might expecting it to be, because the new most impersonated brand in our data is FedEx. So we've traded one shipping company for another, and that is, of course, because threat actors know that people are having stuff shipped all the time, right? I mean, looking at my household, for example, there's probably packages showing up at the house at least 4 out of 7 days of the week, right? And I mean, threat actors try to inject themselves into that communication. I mean, I get text messages probably twice a week that, oh, hey, your package has been delayed. Click here to schedule delivery, and of course it takes you to a malicious site where they're trying to siphon information from you. But that's a popular attack method, and it must be successful. And I imagine you probably see a lot of the same types of communications traffic there in the EU, right, Yvonne?
Yes, exactly. DHL is like the number one delivery company in Germany. So I think 9 out of 10 times I'm getting a delivery, it's by that company. So I'm not surprised to see them listed. FedEx is more international for us. So but I assume here it's just this, I expect this kind of emails and then I get them, and then I'm just more likely to click on them, and that's what they're using.
Right. We also saw noted increases in brand impersonation for Amazon and Facebook, and that's we see ebbs and flows on the social media platforms in our most impersonated brands. I want to say last month or the month before it was Instagram. Anyway, I wrote the reports a month and 2 months ago. You'd think I would remember, but anyway. So my point there, nothing out of the ordinary to see, certain social media accounts be targeted more than others. Again, just ebbs and flows in the industry. So, well, that, Yvonne, maybe we shift over to our kind of news commentary. And the big one that I want to talk about, at least briefly, because you are in the C-suite for a cybersecurity organization, I really want to get kind of your C-suite take on this. And that is the recent Microsoft breach that involved executive team emails being exfiltrated by, ultimately, when we come down to it, is Russian nation-state actors, right? So it's the threat actor group that Microsoft has dubbed Midnight Blizzard. Really, we're talking about Nobelium. It's a well-known state-sponsored threat actor group out of Russia. And this is a really interesting attack because it highlights something in the Microsoft cloud space that's another one of my podcast guests. I feel like I'm mentioning all of the podcast guests in this particular episode, but Paul Schnackenberg and I, we did an episode specifically about the danger of malicious OAuth applications, and OAuth applications were part of this attack. And it's funny I mentioned Paul. Paul and I actually just a day or two ago recorded an episode where we really deep dive this particular attack. So we won't spend a ton of time on it today. But like I said, I really want to get your C-suite opinion on this, Yvonne. But what I want to do, just so all of our listeners are kind of on the same page, I want to do just a quick summary of the attack. And I'm going to quote Microsoft's article here. So I'll put a link to their disclosure in the show notes as well. But the first thing they said, and this really annoys me. There's so much corporate doublespeak in their disclosure. So basically what they said is a quote unquote legacy non-production test tenant unquote was compromised. So I see that and I'm like, okay, you guys had an M365 tenant sitting out there that you forgot about, or it wasn't getting the attention it should, or something, right? So I mean, we got this legacy non-production test tenant. was the initial target of the attack. And it was compromised by a password spray attack. So if you're not familiar with what a password spray attack is, if I'm the threat actor and I want to target a specific organization and I don't want to be detected by things like account lockouts or, like a really heavy brute force attack, those usually surface up in logs. A password spray attack allows me to take a couple of very commonly used password, maybe default passwords, for example, and try a couple of them against this account over here and against this account over here and against this account over here. And over time, it has much the same effect as like a traditional brute force attack. It's just a little bit sneakier. Anyway, that's what the threat actor used to initially gain access into, again, this legacy non-production test tenant. Now, once they were there, and this is where I'm going to quote Microsoft's article here, and I quote, Midnight Blizzard leveraged their initial access to identify and compromise a legacy, they're using the legacy word again, test OAuth application that had elevated access to the Microsoft corporate environment. Now, when we talk about malicious OAuth applications can be multi-tenant, right? Mm-hmm. And so in this case, this OAuth app that existed in this legacy tenant that the threat actor compromised also had elevated access into the Microsoft corporate tenant. From here, and I'm going back to their quote here, the actor created additional malicious OAuth applications, so they made additional applications of their own once they had the access. They created a new user account in the corporate environment to basically grant consent to the malicious applications that they created. And the other important part here is once they had done that, they were able to give the OAuth application, the malicious one that they created, the full access as app role, which allows access to mailboxes. Now, again, if you're not familiar with how OAuth applications operates, they are basically their own service principal in 365 and Azure. I keep wanting to say Azure AD and Azure Entra, Microsoft Entra. They need to stop changing brand names. Anyway, but what's so malicious about that is once the app has been given access, once it has been authorized as an app into the tenant, it doesn't matter anymore. That's the attacker's persistent access. The app will retain that level of access until it has been revoked by an administrator, right? So that's essentially what the threat actor used in this case to gain access to the environment, and then they use that to siphon out executive team emails. So that's a quick summary of what the attack looked like. There are a couple of more, specific bits and pieces here, but at a high level, that's it. Now, Microsoft's response is kind of what has raised a lot of questions, a lot of eyebrows in the security space. Like, for example, why was this MFA tenant, or why was this tenant sitting out there without MFA enabled on it? They did confirm in a second posting that MFA was not enabled on this test tenant. How did their red team? I have to believe they have their own red team. How did they not see that this was an issue? It's like I said, Paul Schneckenberg and I, we deep dive this a lot more than the brief explanation I've given so far. But what are your initial thoughts, Yvonne?
Yeah, I think it's an alarming sign that even a big corporation like Microsoft is not really able to secure their own tenant to a certain degree.
Right.
I think when I read that, I was at a convention, and I remember I was the only person refusing to keep my laptop bag in the luggage room because I was not really sure how good is the access control to the luggage room. So I rather put my bag with me and carried it the whole night. But I was kind of the only one at a cybersecurity conference. So I'm not sure if I'm just paranoid.
Yeah. That's surprising. No, I would do that too, though, and it's amazing. Yeah. And this is probably a whole different episode, but it's amazing when you get into cybersecurity, you start to think about stuff like that, right? Like, Anyway, sorry,
Yeah,
continue.
yeah. I think it's kind of a mindset thing that with us is quite deployed by our CISO, who really takes care of that. So don't go to the bathroom if your notebook is on the train and whatever. And
Right.
yeah, I think even if you do that and kind of secure your notebook, your mobile phone, and so on, some kind of deprecated legacy test tenant can get you into so much trouble that you don't even have a control user as the C-level person yourself. So you kind of have to trust the administration of the test tenants to really make sure that this is decommissioned at some point in time. And yeah, it's a little scary that that doesn't happen. I also remember a lot of our internal red team people reaching out to people like, is this test tenant still necessary? Do you need that account? Can you change passwords? Whatever. And now I think you really see the benefits of that. And yeah, again, scary that big corporation like Microsoft, who do a lot of really, really good things, have such a flaw. But the question is also how many other companies also have similar, I would say, supply chain attack vectors, which are completely open. And yeah, that just makes me kind of confirm that being careful is really necessary, because I would really have an issue with my communication being spread all over the world, and probably everyone thinks that about his company emails, but yeah, so I think for C-level that's something similar. There are company secrets. You are trading by email, by Teams conversations, which are also something you probably don't have under control, but are somewhere at the tenant, which can be a subject to attack and have been before. So, yeah, alarming.
I can only imagine the internal conversations that are happening over at Microsoft right now. Like, okay, what is our risk profile for this breach? Like, what were we talking about? Or, again, this is a mega corporation that produces new products and services all the time. I can only imagine them like, okay, what we were talking about this new product over here that we haven't released yet, and now that information is out in the wild, and it's just going to be a huge headache for from that perspective for sure. You mentioned supply chain attacks, and that's a nice segue into the next news item we're talking about, kind of a brief one here, regarding AnyDesk. AnyDesk is a very popular remote access software. Like remote desk, like Microsoft RDP or VNC. It's got more bells and whistles than those, basic protocols. But I know a lot of IT friends that use it in their organization, so very popular and used quite extensively. Excuse me. But they had a recent breach where the code signing keys were actually compromised. The threat actor gained access to the code signing keys, and at that point, you've got major security issues, right? According to AnyDesk's disclosure, they basically discovered that the code signing keys have been compromised, and they issued a patch which contains new code signing keys. So, from that perspective, everything is under control. So, if you're using AnyDesk in your environment, get the latest patches, you should be good to go as far as this breach goes. But the reason that we bring this up in the monthly report this month is it just kind of highlights the fact that threat actors are trying so hard to produce the next big supply chain attack, right? The one I always think of is SolarWinds, 2021? Don't quote me on that. My memory's not great. But, right, I mean, you think about the supply chain attacks of that scale. They have access to so many different organizations. And I think we're still, as an industry, at risk of supply chain attacks. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. What about you, Yvonne?
Yes, I think we all are, because it's beyond our control. Even if you secure your tenant, your organization to the best way possible, there are some vectors that you cannot control. Those supply chain vectors, they do not go away, and you are kind of subject to, in the end, also Microsoft, AnyDesk, SolarWinds, whoever being responsible with your data or the access to your data, and that's always a risk that you have. So I think you should probably double and triple check the what if cases. So what if code signing key of a vendor becomes compromised? What about our own code signing key?
Right.
So I think that's an important point to really have it thought through before it happens, because you cannot assume that it will never happen to anyone ever. There's so much money at stake if you really get into AnyDesk and on everyone's admin machine and the access and information that you get from there. It's just worth the efforts for the attackers, and I think this is just the beginning of additional attacks throughout the next years.
Yeah, I look at this from the perspective of the MoveIt file transfer supply chain attack as well too, right? They did supply patches that ultimately resolve those issues, but I mean, we're still hearing about organizations that, for whatever reason, were really slow to apply the patch, and there are still organizations over a year later now getting hit by that supply chain attack, right? And Eric Siren and I, we talked about that in a previous episode. You know, those are likely those situations where the MoveIt server is the old dusty server sitting in the corner that nobody knows anything about it, right? And that's why it hasn't been patched. Yeah, but again, it comes back to, I guess I would call it the operational maturity of the IT department within that organization to have a proper inventory, and by extension, they understand their risk profile a little bit more, and they would take steps to patch that, right? Which I think that's going to become more important as we go through the future months and years here. So, well, we've got two more news stories to talk about. This next one probably comes as no surprise to anyone. Another ransomware attack.
Yay!
So another ransomware attack, surprise. This one happened to the company called Johnson Controls, and all the headlines, they really highlight, and this is what caught my eye with this particular article, $27 million price tag. Now, most people would look at that and they would basically say, okay, that was a huge ransom. Well, they didn't pay the ransom. They did not pay the ransom. That $27 million was just the cost of getting back up and running, right? So that was operational cost, that was external cybersecurity expertise cost, huge price tag.
Yeah.
But it brings back the whole conversation, and you and I have talked about this before, Yvonne, is should people pay the ransom or not? And you had you ran into something recently that kind of ties into this conversation. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, 27 million by not paying the ransom. So really recovery costs, everything, that's really a lot. I know about a few providers doing incident response for cybersecurity insurances. So if you get caught, you have an insurance, they bring those people on helping you. And in the past, it was like 60 or 70% of the times they were called that they said, let's pay the ransom, let's go into negotiation, because the ransom is just what they are asking for, maybe based on some numbers they have about the company's money assets, and this has decreased lately to around about 30% likelihood to actually go into ransom negotiation. And if they negotiate, they probably reduce ransom to something like 50%. It really depends on the actual threat actor and the company's financial data. So they're I've been talking to someone who last year had a London-based bank who was subject to a cyber threat attack, a double extortion attack, I think. And they were asked to pay 12 million. And they had a lot of discussions and negotiation, which is actually like a hostage negotiation, but the hostage is your data, so congrats. And in the end, they went off with paying 6 million, and they actually got their data back and not publicly publicized. So in the end, they ended up with 6 million, and it's a London-based bank. I think the number is not so high, and compared to 27 million by not paying, that's probably really a question to ask, especially if you have insurance. But in the end, you're also giving those threat actors even more reason to attack you and to attack others in the future. So I'm still, from an ethical point of view, I would say never pay. You're just heating up the fire. But in the end, if you are in a situation where you have like 27 million versus 6 million, it's probably also a numbers game.
It's a split of 21 million in that particular example. And I mean, it's your opinion's probably going to change based on where you sit in the organization. I'm sure the accounting person is going to be looking at like, okay, guys, $21 million difference, let's pay the ransom. But to your point, I always look at it from the perspective of like, okay, can I trust this other person on the other side of the negotiation? They just ransomed all my stuff. Obviously, I can't trust them. So there's no guarantee that I pay 6 million. I'm going to actually get the decryption key back, right? Yeah. So, and like you said, by paying any ransom, you're just furthering you're just giving them more reason to continue the behavior, right? Yeah. So I think the golden nugget of good news in this whole story here, like you mentioned, is that, it sounds like the number of people paying the ransom has reduced. I think you said around 30%, right? Which the more people that don't pay the ransom, hopefully, maybe someday we can get to a place where ransomware is not as big of an issue. So.
Yeah, and those were only companies who had an incident response team on site. So I think the numbers are a little biased by that, because they might have some cybersecurity insurance making sure that money is even covered. So I assume that probably throughout the whole world, the number is even less than 30%.
Right. Yep. Okay. So our last item, kind of more of a heads up, I think, and just something that I've seen surface in the community over the last couple of months. If you're not aware, Microsoft has finally GA'd Copilot. There's lots of different Copilots, right? There's some Copilots that aren't even released yet. A lot of them are still in public preview. Anyway, the Copilot for Microsoft 365 has now been released, and it's starting to, make its way out into the wild. People are starting to use it. What I've seen bubble up a lot recently in the security community is the fact that Copilot can surface information from within your 365 tenant so easily, right? And you think about all the established 365 environments that are out there. We know, even back in the old on-premises days when we had file servers on-premises, the longer an environment was established, the more one-offs you have in terms of permissions, right? Like, okay, this project is going on over here. Let's give those users permission to do that. Oh, hey, we have to share this file with this person over here. Let's share it. Over time, unless your organization is really, really adamant about keeping everything nice and neat, which I haven't seen very many organizations that do that, by the way, in my now 20 plus years of experience. But over time, you're liable to end up with plenty of misconfigured permissions inside of 365, namely SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, right? Now, what I've seen in terms of comparing that with Copilot is, like I said, Copilot makes it so easy to surface information. Now that Copilot is getting enabled for users within 365 tenants, we could very quickly run into a situation where Copilot surfaces information that a end user probably shouldn't have. So the example that I've seen going around is, hey, Copilot, how have salaries in our industry changed in the last 10 years, right? So the intent of that prompt, right, is to go out to the net and look up salary history in the IT industry, for example, for the last 10 years, and how has the trend changed over time. Well, Copilot, being as it's tied to your 365 tenant and has access to the information in your tenants, could respond with something like, oh, hey, here's how salaries within the company have changed in the last 10 years. This Excel document in the accounting SharePoint site has the details. And now that particular user has easily surfaced information that they probably shouldn't have access to. Or the other case that I've seen come up is the fact that if you do end up with a compromised internal user account, and I'm a threat actor, I would love it if the account I compromised had Copilot enabled, right? Mm-hmm. So, hey, Copilot, show me where the crown jewels are, right? I mean, so that's a concern. Is that something you've been hearing about in your communities too, Yvonne?
Yes, absolutely. On the one hand, the big opportunities that you have with Copilot, I think it's going to make everyone's life so much easier. But on the other hand, the threats that come with it, the unset permissions is really something. I mean, we have permission manager in place. You see how often you kind of have to double check and correct permissions. So I think the probability that people have access to data they probably would never find, but if they just ask Copilot, the access is suddenly real and probably revealing some things people were not aware they have access to and probably shouldn't have access to is real and ongoing. And but on the other hand, it's a lot of opportunities that you don't want to miss out on.
Right. For sure. And you mentioned Permission Manager. So that's a product that we have here internally at Hornetsecurity. Well, not internally. It's a product we sell. So it's a product you can purchase if this is a problem that you need solved. But we created that product because we experienced the pain ourselves of having to manage permissions in SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, and by extension Teams, because when you share stuff in Teams, it's SharePoint under the hood. Well, heck, OneDrive for Business is SharePoint under the hood. That's a whole different discussion. Anyway, Permission Manager can help organizations right-size their permissions if they're getting ready to enable Copilot within their tenant, right? So I'll have a link to Permission Manager in the show notes in case anybody's interested in that. But definitely, it's kind of as we enable new technology within the industry, right? We surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly anymore, but we always create these new little security issues, right? And these little security concerns. So. Well, Yvonne, I think we're about out of time for today, but I want to thank you for coming on the show again and talking through these data points with me. And it's always great getting your C-suite insight on some of these incidents. So that's good having you.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely. And those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. Otherwise, we're available on all the major podcasting platforms, so chances are you can find us wherever you consume your content. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Have a good one. Stay safe out there. We'll catch you again next week for a future episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.